Hey there folks, welcome to Spectrum Pulse. We talk about music, movies, art, and culture. And yes, I know it's been a little while since the last episode of this series, and I also know that most of these albums are comfortably behind schedule. They've been out for a while. Maybe that'll mean I won't get too much nonsense about some of my more contentious takes, so let's get on the pulse. So we got 10 albums on the docket. Let's first go way back and talk about, from Cole Chaney, Mercy.
Run away as fast as you can. And when you get to the end of the tunnel, just keep on running, my friend.
Well, this is way too long overdue. So I've been on the record that country has had a bit of an uneven year, and even that seems about to change with Emily Scott Robinson, James McMurtry, and Jason Eady dropping later this year. But I think the larger truth is that I've just needed to dig a little deeper to find stuff that truly blows my mind. So let me introduce you all to Cole Chaney, an independent Kentucky singer-songwriter who plays a lot of raw, primarily acoustic material. With this debut, he sparked some immediate comparisons to Tyler Childers and Zach Bryan. But I gotta be blunt here, Mercy puts Cole Chaney in a category that's almost of his own, mostly courtesy of his sound, which is acoustic but embraces more Spanish guitar flourishes, surprisingly robust grooves, and one of the best fiddle pickups I've heard since Dave Cobb, but also in a lot of his content. I would be inclined to say that Cole Chaney hits every single trope of Kentucky indie country: a messy relationship with the coal industry, certain amount of reticence towards the mainstream music industry, even if it might be his only way out, and a bones-deep connection to his roots. But there's also something more raw, damn near biblical to a lot of his framing that helps elevate a lot of the scenes. I think what helps here is just how grounded and emotionally honest a lot of the framing is, in between all the ravages of the coal industry, just how much he does not fit in within a popular music paradigm. He's a picker, not a piper, and how even if he or his partner might have some city dreams, he's likely going to wind up back on the mountains. Kind of reminds me more of Ian No and how blazingly direct and effective it can feel in both the darkest moments and the light, with the most striking probably being the undercurrents of yearning on Silver Run and Fever Dream, and the natural disaster of the flood to drive him right back down to earth. That song is haunting. In short, this can be a pretty harrowing, kind of tough listen, and just the problem is that it's that in more ways than one, which I would push down to some of the compositional choices. The album runs just under an hour, and you do notice at this length how uniform his choice of guitar and fiddle are. And yeah, there's a purity to this particular approach where accessibility to anyone unfamiliar, it's not the point at all. But when multiple songs will cross the 5-minute mark, you could wonder how this could have been a little bit more streamlined, refined a little bit. Now granted, when it's so goddamn great at what it does, it's really hard for me to complain all that much, but it's also not about to make it easy on you either. If there's one essential truth expressed here, it's how certain things might be inevitable, but none of it's easy. That being said, on pure guitar and fiddle work alone, I enjoyed this actually more than Zach Bryan, and I did keep coming back to this months late, so solid 8 out of 10. It likely flew under your radar? You should hear it. Next up from Evidence, Unlearning Volume 1.
Dog food. Don't need a needle in my arm, I need a long grooves. Make the wrong moves and history's made. Make the right ones, they might just try to evict where you stay.
So this is a project that I specifically wanted to cover. I've been an Evidence fan for years, for his low-key brand of California boom bap that nails a meditative balance between effective, lyrically bruising MC and more of a thoughtful poet taking stock of his life. The sort of rap you can place in the background really easily, but it'll give you plenty of easy rewards if you actually choose to pay attention. And yet, for his first project away from his Weather trilogy, not counting Step Brothers, I'm just not as gripped by this as I would like to be. Now, he's still a very good rapper and producer. I love the distinctive cool of his old school sample-driven approach, which feels extremely well balanced and melodic to balance against the richer grooves. I like his measured vocal delivery and his distinctly worldly approach to hip-hop, where you can tell that he's actively working to try to see the bigger picture, and he's got all the spitters you would expect to show up on a project like this coming out of Griselda specifically, and yet it would be way too easy to say it's just another Evidence album, but without that added punch of content or insight that makes him special for me. Hell, the album is called Unlearning, which you would think would spur more introspection or experimentation outside of his norm, and while you get some traces of it in the slightly more stripped-back production, the choice of Griselda affiliates as his guest stars on the mic, and maybe some of the larger existential questions in the margins about how much one can really know themselves to discover who they really are, some of which was spurred on by Evidence's looser, more freeform approach to writing and rapping on this album. But the problem is that Evidence is still so locked into his sound and knowing exactly who he is that a lot of the meta-text of the album never really matches the questions in the text. But okay, fine, it didn't have to happen. For as much as Evidence's musings about keeping it real, his creative process, vague aspirational plans as he tours, and his clever nuggets of wit, they're familiar, it is good familiarity. But if there's a point of experimentation, it comes with steps away from hooks and that understated catchiness that used to be one of his secret weapons. I mean, it's weird. This album is clearly trying to take a more deconstructive approach, but it feels like something of a half measure where he sacrificed some of his strengths, and yet the true depth of the unlearning hasn't really happened yet. I don't know, it's still a good Evidence album, and I know some of his diehard fans really adore this, but it just didn't quite click as deeply as I was hoping. So, solid 7 out of 10. I really wanted to like this more, but if you like Evidence, you're still gonna vibe with it. Just saying. Next up from Hiatus Kaiyote, Mood Valiant.
It's not open.
This is one of those acts that I've been vaguely aware of for a while. You can't be around the music festival scene and not hear Hiatus Kaiyote at some point. But it's also one for which I've got a bit of a distant relationship. A band that can definitely hit a textured, off-kilter, but kind of tropical vibe in their blur of jazz, funk, and R&B, but rarely one that's impressed me in the presentation, especially when you start delving into their meandering, scattered compositions that always wind up just being a little less interesting than they really should be. But hey, to the surprise of nobody, they signed a brain feeder, and after 6 years after their breakout with Choose Your Weapon in 2015, what do we get with this? Well, we got the sort of project that's reminded me why I've always been lukewarm at best on this group, leaning more into the jittery, synth-inflected R&B with jazz-funk bass lines, some weirdly grainy vocal pickups around Napalm's squawky crooning, and some textured percussion that I wish the mixing knew how to center in any sort of consistent way. In fact, the production as a whole feels kind of weird on this album. For all the smooth vibes that Hiatus Kaiyote want to cultivate, while I can appreciate the humid, tropical tones of some of the backing solo arrangements on Get Sun or Stone and Lavender, which can sound really pretty, you would think they wouldn't opt for compositional structures that can feel so jerky and awkwardly structured that don't really pay all this off. And you know, that's fine. I've always got more of a ramshackle jam bam vibe to Hiatus Kaiyote anyway, accentuated by the lyrics which always feel perennially undercooked despite some of the naturalistic poetry, but it shows a lack of consistent focus on the elements that could really elevate or impress, like the unsurprisingly great grooves, where instead they will add in all these awkward vocal squawks and pitch shifting and off-key synths that don't really match with anything and just wind up grating on my nerves. It's a lot less psychedelic and more of like a headache, especially on Sparkle Tape Breakup. Now I will say live, nobody's gonna care about my production issues, and at least this is shorter than Choose Your Weapon, which I thought really dragged, but this band's never really been my thing, and in between the limited hooks and the questionable mixing and the utterly annoying closing track, yeah, they still aren't my thing. Strong 5 out of 10, not for me. Next up from Hybrid, Black Halo. Well, Okay, it's been a while since I've gotten one of these acts on my schedule. Yeah, Hybrid is another long-running electronic act, this time an offshoot of late 90s breakbeat called Progressive Breaks that became more known for lush cinematic arrangements and even passages that owe more to vocal trance. And that was kind of a nice surprise as someone who used to listen to a lot of trance, and where I recognize Hybrid from a few compilations that I had heard before. And they had a respectable, not exactly genre-breaking 2000s run. They did a lot of soundtrack work, but in 2018, after the departure of their founding member Chris Healings, they began pulling together new material, first for an album in 2018 that was actually surprisingly decent, but also felt weirdly dated, especially with all those dubstep touches, and now they have this. And oh god, this is gonna sound really unfair, I know that, but here we go. Given that Hybrid have done so much soundtrack work that's become widely imitated across TV and film, listening to this new album really feels like I'm getting a portfolio of background selections with little that really jumps off the page as unique. I mean, it's professionally produced, sure, although whenever it tilts more towards electronic rock or a return to some of the dated dubstep elements, it's got this weirdly gummy feel of never being able to properly explode. But that pristine professionalism has also been so thoroughly co-opted that if you're looking for any real experimentation to put this over the top, you're gonna be left grasping at straws, especially with all the vocals interwoven in that reminds me way too much of vocal trance from a decade plus ago. But hey, you know what, maybe I'm thinking about this wrong. Hybrid have never been that genre-pushing or experimental. Maybe we should focus on refinement, strong compositions that can really stand out. And on some level, with the greater integration of Charlotte Truman's throatier vocals, you can see slightly more conventional song structures, with even a few poppier moments balanced against the extended runtimes that you would expect in this brand of electronic music. This album goes for over an hour, and it definitely feels its length. But, you know, if you consider it on that level, and also recognize that the lyrics are utterly inessential because they really cannot sell the few power ballads or political moments that they try, you realize that on a poppier level, this album just does not impress me all that much. The percussion feels very stiff and underserved in the low end, and the melodic hooks on the pianos and the synth lines, they're just not all that interesting or distinctive. And why does this remind me just so much of the albums that Lindsey Stirling put out in the mid-2010s? But I'll say it, at least Lindsey Stirling would go for broke for some gloriously silly moments, and her violin added some organic character. But hey, outside of the violin, they actually added to the galloping sound of 7 Days. It's probably the best song here, and along with maybe Come Back to Me and Nails. This project is trying to be way more sleek and cool and mature. As a result, it winds up just kind of slipping towards generic and tedious. I mean, at least it ends alright with Sky Full of Diamonds. Look, extremely light 6 out of 10. I'm being generous, even then it's tough to recommend. Next up from Tkay Maidza, Last Year Was Weird, Volume 3.
This time was the last time, 'cause I'm soft like cashmere, spreading out like a wildfire.
I feel like when I talked about Rico Nasty for the first time proper last year, I feel like that right now, because I've been aware of the hype behind Tkay Maidza for her varied but well-constructed flows, her colorful personality with a lot of MIA parallels, the ability to make these pop crossover cuts but also have them sound credible alongside some experimental trap bangers. She seemed to really hit her stride with her Last Year Was Weird series of EPs, especially Volume 2 in 2020, and I wanted to see how well that would translate as the series progressed here. And thus with this, I gotta say I'm a little bit conflicted, to be honest, because it's absolutely a come down with nothing close to her stronger bangers, but at least some of that is intentional with the tilts towards more liquid, organic R&B production, and a little bit more singing from her. Hell, given how the project starts, I thought she'd be in this sort of luxuriant, tropical territory for the majority of the project. All these relaxed flexes to set the vibe spanning from touches of jazz funk, or even early 2000s R&B, and then Syrup drops back into the brittle, bass-heavy knock that's way more familiar for most of the rest of the album. But if you're expecting something as abrasive and hard-hitting as that JPEG Mafia feature on her last album, well, she's got a tribute to Kim Possible on Kim with with Young Baby Tate that's got a smattering of some metallic hyperpop tones and blown out distortion that also contort across Cashmere and Breathe. And you know, if it wasn't for all the chipmunk fragments thrown across high beams, I maybe might have gotten behind that hook more. I don't know, it's odd. With the more introspective and meditative cuts, I honestly found more to like with the pop and R&B moments that she brought to bear, especially for as good of her flows were regardless. But the insight felt oddly scattered and a little bit underwritten. I mean, I'm happy the R&B moments bookended the project, and I do think it's pretty good, but I'm also happy she's getting more of a handle on where she wants to transition her sound for that next full-length project. It's gonna be interesting given the real variety she puts forward. So okay, strong 6 out of 10, but I think I'm gonna like where she goes next a lot more. Next up, the self-titled album from Vince Staples.
Are you with that? I want big racks, I'm gon' flock, I'm gon' stack. Are you with that? Won't forget that shit I saw in my past. Are you with that? Like I'm with that, hope you watching your back.
I've been in a weird place with Vince Staples for a while now. I liked Hell Can Wait, didn't love Summertime '06 or Big Fish Theory, and yet I think FM, his slept-on project from 2018, was his most focused and effective album to date, probably his best. Now this new album was reportedly just as short as FM, but more of a return to the downbeat introspection that opened up his career, courtesy being produced entirely by Kenny Beats. So I was really hoping this would wind up grabbing me, and yet it wound up a bit of a tricky listen. Now firstly, this is a project that runs around 20 minutes, but also has 2 interludes, and this feels a little bit abbreviated as a result, and on some level, you could almost consider it a transitional EP. Vince Staples is getting a little older, and while he's always taken a frank eye to the gunplay and gangsta posturing all around his neighborhood, at this point he just sounds exhausted. I wouldn't quite call it burnout so much as Vince sounds haunted, caught between the bloody nightmare of the streets and a world of fame and escape that doesn't feel remotely real to him. He's just looking for his friends, and who will not ask for money, lovers who don't just want bags to fill their own voids within, where he's not being so much judgmental as, again, he just wants escape. He'd love to go to the beach, but even then that doesn't really feel the void he now feels. The distrust, the depression, the loneliness feels palpable, especially when he can't even trust his fans in the industry which he's got a passion for, but he's also not the kind to take something to dull all the pain. And feeling all of it, it actually kind of hits harder. Now that being said, as much as I really like Vince's framing and content and delivery, the project does really feel over before it really begins, and I found myself wishing he delivered a little more here, especially as a lot of what I'm describing, it's been subtext or outright text on previous albums, especially early on. But surprisingly, I think my larger point of frustration might be the production from Kenny Beats. Maybe it just comes as a cool down after the wild swings of Big Fish Theory or just how hard FM went off, but this is kind of more of what you would expect from Kenny Beats at this point, with the chalky percussion, the creaking melodies that still manage to build to a pretty solid trap bounce, and the occasional pitch-shifted sample that just doesn't really work for me. So overall, again, this is solid. It's got enough hooks to keep me listening, which is why I'm giving it a 7 out of 10, but it feels transitional, a setup to Vince's next big swerve. That might be more interesting. Next up from Tones and I, welcome to the Madhouse.
I would just fly away. And I always knew I couldn't stay. So I had a dream that I'd just fly away.
Look, y'all know why this is on my schedule. It's for 2 reasons. One, I might be actually one of the few people who still likes Dance Monkey, which I thought was a smarter and more potent song than many people thought or gave credit. Now granted, I also tolerate her voice more, so that wasn't too bothersome. But 2, whenever an album gets a score from a colleague that in the far extremes of the scale, folks line up to check out to see whether it's an outlier or other critics actually agree. And thus for this debut album, okay, really? This is the album that everyone's now calling the next worst thing ever? Are you serious? It's bizarre to me because just listening to this, if anything, it's just way more boring, generic, and oddly undercooked in comparison with Dance Monkey. Which means that if you're comparing this to the other pop acts of the past 5 or so years, it's nowhere near as badly produced as Bebe Rexha, is not as screamingly annoying as AJR at their worst, or as boringly incompetent as Julia Michaels, or as faintly icky as Melanie Martinez, where you can actually draw some comparisons comparisons and the more garish textures, but this album just feels nowhere near as conceptual. In fact, even Tones and I's distinctive squawking is downplayed for the majority of this album, where the closer parallel in the vocals might be Alessia Cara's huskier register, but with just more robust backing vocal arrangements. But again, as somebody who didn't really mind Tones and I's exaggerated delivery, I honestly wish there could have been more for it. Just go for it, really accentuate your personality. And that's the odd thing. For an album that starts off by trying to set up the baby's first spook house vibe with the opening track, and then continue into the warped vibe of No Sleep and Child's Play, the rest of the compositions play way closer to the sort of straightforward percussion-heavy clunkers that filled up mainstream pop in the latter half of the 2010s. But that also means the problems with that sound surge to the forefront, in between some questionable synth and effect choices and the production that definitely shows a lack of subtlety in all the messy percussion blending, and how outside of the vocals being front and center, the melodies are very thin here. Not a good sign given how often this album really wants to build a lot of theatrical bombast and it can't. But in other words, this is an album that lives and dies on Tones and I as a presence, but also wants to make that presence seem more accessible when I'm not sure that was ever fully in the cards. Which is kind of awkward, because her writing doesn't really do more to accentuate that personality. The emotional core of this album is rooted in the loss of a friend who had once lived with her and her friends in that titular Madhouse, as well as her depression, her anxiety, her struggles to come out of that. But I gotta say, the lyrics feel painfully basic in exploring some of that grief and angst. You could be forgiven in thinking that most of this plays to a lot of stock self-esteem anthems, or the occasional bratty party moment that's nowhere near as edgy as it thinks it is. But again, that just makes it all the more forgettable for me. I have heard dozens of albums that play in this territory. It's not special. And while the production issues will tip it away from quality, this is not worth hating. Let's step back for a second. Strong 4 out of 10. If you hate a Dance Monkey, you're not gonna like this, but as someone who still kinda likes that song, just not that much to say. Move on. Next up from Willow, Lately I Feel Everything.
Just so you know.
So there's a reason I've generally avoided talking about the artistic efforts of the Smith kids, and no, it's not due to any comparison to their parents' art. It's more because the conversation is thorny in a way that's kind of tough to describe, because on the one hand, growing up in that house and that environment could not have been easy for anyone involved. On the other hand, I've observed similarities between Jaden and Willow Smith, and that they often have enough raw talent, resources, or even taste to make good art, but the vision to execute and refine it is woefully underdeveloped, which is why on a textural level it might seem like there's potential, but the content is unfocused at best, and at worst, the sort of pretentiousness that is desperately clawing for transgressive meaning, but utterly implodes with any sort of deeper analysis. Now, Willow's profile is a lot less mimetic than her brother's, but I've listened to her entire catalog before now, and it's just as apparent and frustrating with these issues, which is why a hard swerve into more composed rock music, hi Travis Barker, you know, it might give her the foundation that she's been seeking? Well, alright, look, I don't want to call this trend chasing, mostly because it's not at all filtered through the Travis Barker lens that would have more pop-punk accessibility, and there's enough scrappy alternative edges with the down-tuned guitars and the messy scuzz to seem like it might click in that lane. But I also know my punk. I gotta be blunt with this. The majority of these songs feel like undercooked first drafts, and if this wasn't made by Willow Smith with the backing of Rock Nation and Travis Barker behind it, nobody would care about this album. The grooves are barely here, especially the bass lines. The drums are overemphasized, and not just on the songs produced by Travis Barker or on Grow. They just sound like shit, much like all the synths on this project. And then the guitars are really overcompressed and thin. And I really do not like how Willow's vocals are produced here. A ton of echo, they're further back in the mix, which to me screams distance from the target audience, and not quite obscuring how she doesn't really have a real edge to her delivery, which you would hope she would have to make rock music. More grating is the production as a whole. It's too clean by half, but with mixing and mastering that shows less intentional rough edges and more just amateurish sloppiness, which might work with some of the baffling indie pivots that sound okay, but they don't fit in with anything else here. And then we have our guest stars. Don't get me wrong, it is cool to hear Tierra Whack drop a verse from out of nowhere, and for Avril Lavigne to pop up for 2000s cred, and for Cherry Glazer of all people to deliver some great garage rock scuzz on the closing track, but their delivery and vocal production seems to be imported from different, much better albums, and it's actively distracting for me. But then there's the content. I mentioned this when I covered Transparent Soul on Billboard Breakdown a couple weeks ago, how it felt weirdly haughty, not all that populist. Well, that continues across the majority of this album, with a lot of kiss-off moments and relationship melodrama all along Willow's self-care journey, all which seems to be terminally underwritten as per usual. But then there are these odd moments, like on Naive, where she talks about running from the cops and her friends getting shot with rubber bullets, and how she doesn't want to be naive and hoping for a better future, but by the time we get to Breakout, where she actually seems to regain all of her confidence, all the while quoting Kanye West. But you know what? It is a quotation and a comparison that makes sense, because I'm reminded of how much Kanye was ripping off Death Grips for Yeezus and doing what he thought he was supposed to do within that sound and genre. Well, he still managed some transgressive moments and great production, though. Whereas this has neither. Folks, come on, there's so much better punk out there if you look beyond the name. 4 out of 10, skip this. Next up from KSI, All Over the Place.
Them good days, fly me away, away, you're my holiday.
You know, when I went on Dead End Hip Hop in 2017 and talked about the rise of YouTube stars making what I termed fuckboy rap, it led to a messy conversation of folks coming in outside the culture for a quick buck and then bouncing. Hell, just look at the Paul brothers. Now, 4 years later, I've got mixed opinions on where I was coming from there. I mean, sure, trap became the dominant sound and everyone in every genre started doing it, but fuckboy rap remains a pretty obnoxious presence on the Hot 100, and it's not like these acts are the dominant charting force for whatever chart matters in this conversation. But you know, if you flip across the ocean to the UK, you've got KSI, who is very much involved in that diss track scene, but KSI leveraged his rising fame to continue pursuing music with bigger connections than ever, and then moving into outright albums and surprisingly robust charting presence in the UK. And I'll be honest, I actually considered talking about Dissimulation, but there really wasn't much to say about it. Generic pop trap, notable by being carried on its guest collaborations and often being more forgettable than awful, with KSI often being the least interesting parts of his own album. But apparently, this new album was actually an improvement, and for some reason, somebody cared enough for me to request it. And wow, obvious joke about the project living up to its title, it's obvious. You know what, let's get the problems out of the way first. The mixing and mastering is wildly inconsistent from track to track as it whipsaws from genre to genre. KSI's singing, especially his rather poor attempts at falsetto, they can be rough at best. And whenever he tries to brag about YouTube's success, I'm sorry, I said this with Quatica, it sounds painfully corny, especially alongside rappers like Bugsy Malone, 21 Savage, and Lil Durk. Not saying KSI doesn't have skills as a rapper, his flow's nothing all that special, but he's competent, he's got plenty of personality to compensate, especially as he doesn't always go to the usual trap standbys in his content, but when it usually defaults to flexing with the occasionally bafflingly corny reference, it's hard for me to take any of this all that seriously, especially when it's rare that the production rises above mid-tier for whatever of style of trap or drill that he's flowing over, especially with all the chipmunk fragments that we didn't need. So okay, you'd think the pop songs would be better, just given how many of them are on this album, but I gotta be honest, I'm not sure KSI adds enough as a vocal or lyrical presence to really elevate any of these, especially with a weird lack of personal detail. It's odd, this is an album that's trying to go in so many different directions, show a lot of versatility, but outside of mentioning the YouTube stuff, I'm left feeling that KSI is a bit of a blank slate on record, where you could swap them out and few people would know the difference with these songs. songs. So you're left scrabbling for whatever cuts that aren't held back by corny moments or elevated by the guest stars, and, well, Patience with Youngblood and Polo G, that was good. I liked Really Love with Craig David until that awful second verse from KSI. Rico Love sounds great on Flash It. I guess I'll say Holiday, it's a sweet little chill moment, but outside of that, 5 out of 10, I'd take it or leave it. And finally, from Clairo, Sling.
Skies, nobody had everything. I pulled to shed your memory. Could you say you even tried? You haven't called your family twice. I can hope tonight goes differently, but I show up to the party just in case.
It's been weird watching the waves of hype with Clairo. I remember the buzz when she first went viral in and around bedroom pop as a homegrown talent with remarkable poise and vulnerability, and for a decent bit of that to be punctured when it was exposed just how well connected her families were in order to help her get in the door and then really blow up. Then with the release of Immunity in 2019, it became apparent that her predominantly Gen Z audience didn't really care all that much, and the album did get some modest critical acclaim, so I checked it out, and oh wow, it did very little for me. I mean, call it a case of Bandcamp overexposure where this sound is dime a dozen, or that Clairo's delivery and writing were not really all that impressive, and the production's cleaner edges felt very oddly blended. I guess I can thank Rostam for that. But this felt very middle of the road, and popular because people didn't want to dig for deeper and more interesting stuff on Bandcamp. But you know, I did hear her sophomore album was an improvement, with Jack Antonoff of all people stepping in to help on the production, and what we got now feels less like bedroom pop and more adjacent to the barely jazzy, vaguely retro adult alternative coffee house music that flooded the 2000s. Undoubtedly a move that makes sense given modern trends, but oh, man alive, if Clairo was not that interesting to me before, she sure as hell isn't now. It also helped me realize something about Jack Antonoff's production in recent years that's really standing out. While he will assemble a classically inspired and generally pretty backdrop behind a lot of the singers, and with Clairo I actually think it's a positive they brought in more multi-tracking to give her a bit more presence in the more ornate mix, especially given just how flagrantly this album is pulling in from the goopier side of 60s pop singer-songwriter material, with all the Hammond organ, the touches of horns, some actually really pretty strings, and then the watery guitars, or whatever the hell that tuning was on Zinnia's. But if Jack Antonoff does not have much to work with, he can't spin underwhelming compositions or a weak vocal presence into real gold. But I do think that's also kind of true with Clairo here. Her style of writing is meandering, with meter shifts and key changes, often sliding through in a way that should be way more interesting than it is. But her vocal delivery is so prim and twee and polished that I don't pick up any of the intensity that she wants to imply with the writing. Maybe not even all that much intimacy. And frankly, in a year with Lucy Dacus and Charlie Adams and Emily Scott Robinson right around the corner, I don't remotely get it from the writing here either. Now, to be fair, I think expecting that level of rawness is kind of off the table. Clairo is targeting a very old-fashioned feminine perspective and approach. It's trying to be more flowery, subtle, and intimate, even though I don't buy the intimacy. Maybe even more submissive and domestic. This is an album that's targeting bigger implications in growing up and the weight of certain expectations, but is playing in smaller emotions to explore them. And I get that appeal to the target audience who will never seriously challenge any of those societal expectations. They need music too. And you know what? There are moments in which I can actually feel the emotional drama, at least in the writing. Blouse is potent, highlighting how she's trying to get a guy to pay attention, but all he's doing is staring down her shirt. And given that she's not really strong enough at that moment to confront him, she doesn't want to make a scene, she just keeps trying to work to get what she wants. Then there's Amoeba, where she second-guesses her own moments of running wild and partying instead of connecting with her family, trying to drill into what she really values. And then there's Reaper, where she seriously contemplates what domestic life might mean for her longer term. I mean, it's worth mentioning that Clairo's 22, but different conversation. But especially when she places it alongside the depression she acknowledges on Little Changes, and especially Just for Today. But I don't know, the execution just feels really off for me, with no interest in actually selling the implied heavier stakes of some of these moments, especially in tone, because she already seems to know that she's gonna fall in line, which kind of flies in the opposite direction of all the great country or folk or singer-songwriters who will take all those little human moments and then amplify the emotional drama, often against those systems. Makes you realize on the album opener Bambi, she might be referring more to herself in conversations with the industry than anyone else. I mean, compare that with how Billie Eilish writes about the music industry on Happier Than Ever, and you might get some of my trepidations here. And you know, while the word privilege is what springs to mind the most, although knowing that Clairo is out as bisexual shifts this dynamic in weird ways beyond the brief mentions on Partridge, and I honestly really wish she had delved deeper into some of those implications, especially with as much as she touches on the domestic vibe and what that can mean for a bisexual couple. What I'm reminded of most is when a few women I follow in indie country began examining the fashion and the aesthetic of cottagecore on Twitter, and now it can feel very conservative in weirdly disquieting ways, especially marketed at a younger generation. I mean, if you don't want Gen Z pushing back on bad systems, have it marketed right from their mouths. Right? You know, I can't blame Clairo for this. The struggle of knowing where you fit in within gender and societal expectations, that's very real in your early 20s as you grow up. And she is free to do wherever the hell she wants, whether she wants to settle down or not. But you also can't blame me if the industry plant narrative slips back into the picture, with that being the thematic destination and presentation, kind of unaware of the larger implications. Now, some of you might say, well, okay, you give this a pass in country. First off, I rarely do. But even if so, country is plainly open with all the conservative themes. Clairo is making baroque pop singer-songwriter material marketed at Gen Z, and also doesn't seem to show much of the thematic self-awareness in order to flesh out the dramatic framing, make it feel more realistic, especially in the presentation. So you don't need to tell me it's not for me. Obviously, I know that. I'm not the target audience, and even then I will acknowledge she has improved as a singer-songwriter. But I gotta say, beyond my thematic issues, it's a very tepid, thoroughly underwhelming project. It doesn't earn any of the historical comparisons it wants to make. I mean, it's pretty, but it's inert. And that might be very telling of Clairo's future. 5 out of 10. I get the album's appeal. I get the target audience. I'm just not aligned with either of them. Just saying. So yeah, thanks a lot for watching. If you'd like to like and subscribe, I'd be more than grateful. I am sure I said things to annoy or piss you off. Especially, hell, I had a number of controversial opinions in this one. But hopefully we're getting back on schedule here. If you guys would like to see more, place your comments, have fun. Beyond that, anything else I might be able to do to improve my presentation, I'm all ears. If you guys want to get albums on my schedule for future episodes of On the Pulse, link to my Patreon right over there. Please do not feel obligated to do so. It's tough times for everyone. And again, I do have some pretty stringent rules and veto privileges in which I've applied. But just keep all that in mind if you're curious and want to talk to me more about that. But the option is available. Till then, I'm Mark. You're watching On the Pulse on Spectrum Pulse. And I'll see you next time.